"Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the bar," he said, loud enough to cut through the music like a blade through glass. And just like that, the laughter dimmed. Conversation stalled mid-sentence, and every eye in the room turned toward Naomi Carter as if she had just done something wrong without knowing what it was, her fingers still loosely wrapped around the stem of a half-full wine glass, the deep red liquid catching the chandelier light and trembling slightly from the sudden shift in the air, while the jazz band in the corner faltered for half a beat before awkwardly continuing, softer now, uncertain, as though even they felt the tension tightening across the polished marble floor. And Naomi didn't move at first, didn't argue, didn't even blink. She just turned her head slowly toward the voice, meeting the gaze of Officer Ethan Cole, who stood a few feet away in a pressed uniform that looked too stiff for a night meant to celebrate, his posture straight, his expression calm but edged with something colder, something practiced, the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice because it expected compliance. And around them, the guests, men in tailored suits, women in evening gowns that shimmered under the warm lights, shifted subtly, some leaning closer to see better, others stepping back just enough to avoid being part of whatever was about to unfold. Because this kind of moment, the kind where one person is singled out in a room full of people, had a way of making everyone uncomfortable without anyone stepping in, and Naomi could feel it, not as fear, not even as anger, but as a familiar weight settling quietly in her chest, the kind that came from being watched, judged, measured without a word being spoken. And still she held her ground, her shoulders relaxed, her chin level, her eyes steady as she asked, softly but clearly, "Is there a problem, officer?" And for a split second, something flickered in Ethan's gaze, not doubt, not hesitation, but a brief recalibration, as if her composure hadn't matched the script he expected. Yet he recovered quickly, stepping closer, the faint scent of cologne and starch trailing with him, his eyes scanning her from head to toe in a way that lingered just a second too long to be casual. "We've had reports," he said, his voice controlled, measured, "of someone entering without an invitation." And though he didn't say her name, didn't point directly, the implication hung heavy in the air between them, and Naomi felt the room lean in, invisible but undeniable, waiting to see how she would respond, waiting to see if she would shrink, apologize, disappear. But instead she let out a small breath, almost inaudible, and glanced down briefly at the wine in her hand before looking back up at him. "I was invited," she said, not defensive, not pleading, just stating it like a simple fact. And that seemed to irritate him more than anything, because certainty without submission had a way of unsettling people who were used to control. And he reached out then, not aggressively but firmly, his fingers closing around her wrist just enough to stop her from stepping back. And in that moment, the glass tilted, a thin stream of red spilling over the rim and onto the pale fabric of her dress, blooming outward like a stain that couldn't be ignored, a visual mark that drew a few quiet gasps from nearby guests. And Naomi's eyes dropped to it for a second, watching the color spread, before lifting again, steady, unbroken, her voice even as she said, "You're spilling my drink." And for a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if deciding whether this was about to escalate or dissolve. But Ethan didn't release her, not yet, his jaw tightening slightly as he replied, "Then maybe you should have thought about that before coming somewhere you don't belong." And there it was, not shouted, not crude, but sharp enough to land. And the silence that followed was louder than any music, louder than any argument, because everyone heard it, everyone understood it, even if no one said a word. And Naomi felt the weight of it press against her, the assumption, the dismissal, the quiet rewriting of who she was in a single sentence. And still she didn't pull away, didn't raise her voice, she just looked at him, really looked at him, as if trying to understand how someone could be so certain of something they knew nothing about. And then, with a calm that didn't match the tension around them, she said, "Maybe you're looking at the wrong person." And that was when a few heads turned, subtle but noticeable, a ripple of uncertainty passing through the crowd, because confidence like that didn't come from nowhere. And Ethan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, his grip loosening slightly though he didn't step back. And in that tiny shift, that barely perceptible pause, something changed in the room, not enough to break the moment, but enough to crack it, just a little, like the first line in glass before it shatters. And somewhere near the entrance, unseen by most, a set of doors opened quietly, letting in a sliver of cooler light from the hallway beyond, a contrast to the warm glow of the party. And though no one had turned yet, though no voice had spoken, the air itself seemed to shift, as if something, or someone, had just arrived that didn't fit the version of events unfolding in front of them. The door did not slam or announce itself. It simply opened with a quiet mechanical sigh. And yet the shift it caused moved through the room like a change in pressure before a storm, subtle but undeniable, and Naomi felt it before she saw it. A faint cool draft brushing against her arm, where Ethan's grip had just loosened enough for her to breathe without resistance. And for the first time since he had approached her, his attention flickered away, just briefly, toward the entrance, not fully turning, not yet, but enough to break the perfect line of authority he had been holding. And Naomi noticed, not with satisfaction, not with relief, just with awareness, the kind that comes from learning to read rooms where words are never the first thing that matters. And around them, a few guests closer to the doors shifted their posture, shoulders straightening, conversations dissolving into polite silence, as if something more important had just entered the space, something that required a different kind of attention. And Ethan felt it too, the subtle recalibration of the room. The way eyes were no longer locked solely on Naomi, but drifting, splitting, creating a tension he could not fully control anymore. And that seemed to tighten something in him, because control, once cracked, even slightly, has a way of slipping. So he adjusted his stance, releasing her wrist completely now, but stepping half a foot closer, as if to reclaim the space he had already started to lose, his voice lowering but sharpening. I am asking you one more time to show me your invitation. And the way he said it made it sound less like a request and more like a final test, as if compliance now would rewrite the moment, smooth it over, let everyone return to their drinks and quiet judgments. But Naomi did not reach for a purse, did not search her phone. She simply held his gaze, her expression unchanged, and said, "You are asking me to prove something you have already decided I do not have." And there was no accusation in her tone, just clarity. And that clarity landed harder than anger ever could, because it stripped the moment down to exactly what it was. And for a second, Ethan did not respond, not because he did not have words, but because the ones he had prepared did not fit anymore. And in that small gap, the room leaned further into silence, the music fading again into something distant, almost irrelevant. And Naomi could feel the stain on her dress beginning to cool against her skin, the fabric clinging slightly, a physical reminder of how quickly things could change in a single moment. And she glanced down again, not out of embarrassment, but out of simple acknowledgement, then reached for a napkin from the bar beside her, dabbing at the edge of the spill with careful, unhurried movements, as if refusing to let the situation rush her into anything. And that, more than anything, unsettled the people watching, because there was no panic, no apology, no attempt to disappear, just a quiet refusal to be reduced to the role being placed on her. And a server standing nearby hesitated before stepping closer, offering a fresh cloth without a word, their eyes meeting Naomi's for a fraction of a second in a silent exchange that said more than any conversation could. And Naomi accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you." Her voice soft but steady. And Ethan watched that interaction with a tightening jaw, as if the simple act of someone assisting her without question disrupted the narrative he was trying to maintain, because it introduced doubt, and doubt spreads faster than certainty when given even the smallest opening. And he exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath, before saying, "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be." But even as he said it, the words sounded thinner, less grounded than before, and Naomi set the stained napkin aside, the red mark still visible but contained now, no longer spreading, and looked back at him. "It was not complicated until you decided it was," she replied, and somewhere behind him, a voice began to move through the room, low at first, indistinct, not calling out, not demanding attention, but carrying with it a kind of weight that made people instinctively shift, creating space without being asked. And one by one, heads turned toward the source, conversations dissolving completely now into a respectful quiet. And Ethan felt it before he heard it clearly. The way the room had stopped responding to him entirely. The way authority had quietly relocated somewhere behind him, and his posture stiffened, not in confidence this time, but in recognition, and Naomi saw it happen. The exact moment when certainty gave way to something else, something less stable, and she did not turn immediately, did not look past him to see who had entered. She simply watched him. Because his reaction told her everything she needed to know, and the distance between them, only a few feet, suddenly felt very different, not because the space had changed, but because the balance within it had, and for the first time since he had approached her, Ethan did not speak right away, his attention pulled backward by something stronger than the situation in front of him, and in that pause, that suspended second where the entire room seemed to hold its breath again, Naomi stood. Exactly where she was, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, waiting, not for rescue, not for validation, but for the truth of the moment to reveal itself without her having to force it. The voice did not rise above the room, yet. It carried through it with a quiet authority that made people step aside without being told, a path opening naturally between clusters of guests, as if the space itself recognized who was walking through it. And Ethan turned fully now, his shoulders squaring in reflex before tightening again when he saw the man approaching, tall, composed, dressed in a dark tailored suit that did not need to announce its value because it fit too precisely to be anything else. His presence calm, but unmistakable. The kind that did not demand attention but simply redirected it, and the conversations that had once filled the room dissolved completely into silence as Governor Marcus Carter moved forward with measured steps, his gaze steady, not scanning the crowd, not acknowledging the dozens of eyes on him, but fixed on a single point ahead, and Naomi watched the shift ripple outward, the way people adjusted their posture, the way even the staff seemed to stand a little straighter, and she could feel the air change again. Heavier now, not tense in the same way as before, but weighted with expectation, with something that did not need to prove itself, and Ethan cleared his throat quietly, a small sound that felt louder than it should have in the stillness, his hand dropping fully to his side as he stepped back half a pace, not retreating entirely, but no longer occupying the same space with the same certainty. And for the first time since the moment began, he looked unsure of where to stand. Where to place himself in a situation that was no longer defined by his voice, and the governor stopped just a few feet away, his eyes moving briefly from Ethan to Naomi, taking in the scene in a single glance, the stain on her dress, the discarded napkin, the posture of the room itself, and though his expression did not harden, did not shift into anger or surprise, there was a quiet calculation in it, the kind that comes from understanding more than what is being said out loud, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, but carried clearly to every corner of the room. Is there something happening here that I should know about? And the question was simple, almost casual, yet it landed. With a weight that made Ethan straighten instinctively, his training pulling him into form even as his confidence faltered. Sir, he began, his tone respectful now, careful. I was addressing a situation regarding an unverified guest. And he gestured slightly toward Naomi, not as boldly as before, not as certain, and the governor's gaze followed that gesture back to her, resting there for a moment longer this time, not questioning, not assessing in the way Ethan had, but recognizing, and Naomi met his eyes without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her posture the same calm stillness she had held from the beginning, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them that did not need words. Something understood without explanation, and the governor nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before turning his attention back to Ethan. Unverified, he repeated, as if testing the word itself, and then, after a pause that stretched just long enough to make the room lean in again, he said, "And what exactly made you question her presence?" And it was not an accusation, not yet, but it was not neutral either. It was a question that required an answer with substance. And Ethan hesitated, just for a second, his eyes flicking toward Naomi and then back, searching for something solid to stand on. We received a report, he said, the words coming slower now, that someone had entered without proper clearance. And even as he spoke, the explanation felt thinner than it had before, less convincing under the weight of the room's attention, and the governor listened without interrupting, his expression steady, his hands resting loosely at his sides, And when Ethan finished, the silence returned again, deeper this time, more focused, as if everything was narrowing down to a single point. And then the governor spoke again, his voice just as calm, just as controlled. "And did you ask her name?" And the question was simple, direct, cutting through everything that had been built around it. And Ethan blinked once, the answer catching in his throat before he forced it out. "No, sir." And that single admission seemed to shift the room more than anything else had so far, a quiet realization settling over the people watching, and the governor's gaze did not leave him. "Then let me make this easier for you," he said, and there was no change in volume, no rise in tone, but something in the cadence of his words carried a finality that settled into the space like a closing door, and Naomi felt it too, not as relief, not as victory, but as the moment aligning itself, and she remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes steady, as the governor turned slightly, angling his body just enough to include her fully in the conversation, and then, without hesitation, without emphasis, without any need to elevate the moment beyond what it already was, he said, "That is my daughter." And the words did not echo, did not ring out dramatically, but they landed with a precision that silenced everything completely, the kind of silence that follows not confusion, but understanding. And Ethan's posture shifted again, the last traces of certainty draining from it as the reality of the situation settled in, his shoulders lowering just slightly, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second before returning, and Naomi watched him, not with satisfaction, not with resentment, but with the same quiet clarity she had held from the beginning, because nothing about her had changed in that moment. Only the way the room saw her had, and the difference between those two things hung in the air, undeniable, impossible to ignore. The silence did not break immediately after the words were spoken. It deepened, stretching across the room like something physical, pressing gently against every person standing there. And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because the meaning of what had just been said did not require repetition. It settled on its own, heavy and precise, and Ethan stood in that silence with his posture still upright, but no longer anchored, his breath measured as if he were trying to regain control over something that had already shifted beyond his reach, his eyes returning to Naomi, really seeing her now, not as a question, not as a problem to solve, but as a person he had misjudged in a way that could not be undone by simply correcting his tone. And Naomi held his gaze without hostility, without triumph, just steady, her expression unchanged, as if the moment unfolding around them had always been separate from who she was. And that separation was what made it impossible to ignore, because nothing about her presence had altered, only the perception surrounding it had, and that realization moved quietly through the crowd, visible in the way shoulders relaxed, in the way some guests shifted their weight uncomfortably, glancing at one another as if silently acknowledging their own role in the stillness that had allowed the moment to escalate. And the governor remained where he stood, not stepping closer, not raising his voice, his presence alone enough to hold the space in place. His attention still on Ethan, who now spoke again, his voice lower, more careful. "Sir, I was not aware." And he paused, the words incomplete, because awareness was not the issue anymore. And even he seemed to understand that as he finished, "I was following protocol." And the explanation sounded practiced, familiar, something he had said before in other situations, but here it carried less weight, because protocol did not account for assumption, and assumption was what had filled the gap before any real question had been asked. And the governor listened without interruption, his expression composed, but there was a slight narrowing in his eyes, not anger, not even disappointment, but a recognition of something deeper, something that extended beyond this single moment. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, almost reflective. "Protocol is meant to protect people, not define them." And the sentence settled into the air with a quiet clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, though the motion felt more like acknowledgement than agreement, and Naomi shifted her weight slightly then, not stepping away, not stepping forward, just adjusting her stance as the tension in the room began to ease, the edges of it softening as people started to breathe again, the faint hum of conversation threatening to return, but holding back, as if waiting for permission. and a woman near the bar reached for her glass again, her hand still, careful, as though any sudden movement might disrupt whatever fragile balance had just been restored. And Naomi glanced briefly at the stain on her dress, the dark red mark still visible under the light, no longer spreading but not erased either. A quiet reminder of how the moment had begun, and she brushed her fingers lightly over the fabric, not trying to hide it, just acknowledging its presence before letting her hand fall back to her side. And Ethan noticed the gesture, his eyes following it for a second before lifting again, and something in his expression shifted, not fully into regret, not yet, but into awareness, a recognition that what had happened could not be undone by a simple apology. And yet he spoke anyway, because silence now would only deepen the weight already pressing down on him. "Miss Carter," he said, the name coming carefully, deliberately, as if placing it correctly might repair something. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." And the word misunderstanding lingered, thin, insufficient, and Naomi heard it, felt its limitations, but she did not challenge it, did not correct him. She simply looked at him, her voice even as she replied, "You did not misunderstand me." And the distinction landed softly but firmly, shifting the responsibility back to where it belonged without raising her tone, and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, the truth of that statement settling in, because it reframed everything in a way that left no room for easy resolution. And the governor's gaze moved between them briefly, observing, not intervening, allowing the moment to unfold on its own terms. And then he stepped slightly to the side, just enough to open the space again, signaling without words that the scene did not need to escalate further, that the room could begin to return to itself. And slowly, almost cautiously, the music picked back up, the band finding its rhythm again, softer at first, then stronger, filling the silence with something familiar, something that allowed people to shift their attention away without pretending that nothing had happened. And conversations resumed in low tones, careful, measured, as if everyone was aware that the atmosphere had changed in a way that would not fully reset. And Naomi took a small breath, the first one that felt unburdened since the moment had begun, and she turned slightly, not toward the exit, not toward the center of the room, but toward the bar, setting her empty glass down with a quiet, deliberate motion, the faint sound of it touching the surface grounding in its simplicity. And for a second, she closed her eyes, just briefly, before opening them again. Her posture the same, her presence unchanged, because nothing about her had required correction, only recognition, and that recognition now lingered in the room, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like a shift in light that once seen could not be unseen. The music returned first, soft at the edges, like the room was testing whether it was safe to breathe again. And conversations followed in low murmurs that never quite reached their earlier volume, as if everyone understood that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone by simply pretending it had not happened. And Naomi stood there for a moment longer, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the bar, feeling the cool, polished surface beneath her palm, grounding herself in something steady while the world around her recalibrated. And she could feel the glances still, quieter now, more careful, not the sharp scrutiny from before, but something more reflective, something that carried a hint of self-awareness. And she did not turn to meet them, did not acknowledge the attention. She simply existed within it without letting it define her. And behind her, the governor moved closer, not with urgency, not with authority, but with the ease of someone who did not need to claim space because it was already given. And he stopped beside her rather than in front of her, positioning himself not as a shield but as a presence. And for a second neither of them spoke, the silence between them different from the one that had filled the room earlier, this one quieter, more familiar. And Naomi exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as she said, "You did not have to step in like that." Her voice low, meant only for him. And he let out a small breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, not amused, not dismissive, but something softer. "I did not step in for you," he replied, his tone even. "I stepped in because it was already too late for anyone else to ask the right question." And she turned her head just enough to look at him, her expression thoughtful, not surprised, because she understood what he meant, the difference between being defended and being recognized, and that distinction mattered more. than anything that had just happened. And across the room, Ethan remained where he was, no longer at the center of attention, no longer the axis around which the moment revolved, and that shift seemed to leave him uncertain of his next move, his hands resting at his sides, his posture still controlled, but lacking the certainty it had carried before, and he watched them for a second, not intruding, not approaching, just observing, as if trying to understand where he fit into a situation that had moved beyond him. And then, after a brief hesitation, he stepped forward, his movements measured, deliberate, the decision to approach not impulsive but chosen. And as he reached them, he stopped at a respectful distance, not too close, not imposing, and spoke again, his voice quieter than before, stripped of the edge it had carried earlier. "Governor, Miss Carter," he said, acknowledging both of them, his gaze steady but no longer confrontational. "I want to make this right." And the words hung there, simple, direct, but uncertain in how they would be received. And Naomi turned fully this time, facing him, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, and for a moment she did not respond, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was choosing it carefully. And the governor remained silent beside her, his presence steady but non-interfering, allowing her the space to speak for herself. And that, more than anything, shaped the moment, because it made it clear that whatever happened next would not be decided for her. And Naomi looked at Ethan, really looked at him, seeing not just the uniform, not just the authority it represented, but the person behind it, the hesitation, the awareness that had replaced certainty. And she said, "Then start by understanding what went wrong." Her voice even, not harsh, not forgiving, just honest. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it. "I made an assumption," he admitted, the words coming without hesitation now, because there was no point in avoiding them, "and I acted on it." And saying it out loud seemed to settle something in him, not resolving it, not erasing it, but acknowledging it in a way that made it real. And Naomi held his gaze for a second longer before giving a small nod, not approval, not acceptance, just recognition that he had taken the first step. And the room around them continued to move, conversations rebuilding, laughter returning in small, tentative bursts, but the moment between them remained its own space, separate from everything else. And Naomi reached for a fresh glass of water that had been placed quietly on the bar, lifting it with steady hands, the condensation cool against her fingers. And she took a small sip, letting the simplicity of the action reset her focus. And then she set it down again, the faint sound grounding in its normalcy. And Ethan stepped back slightly, giving them space, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just present. And the governor glanced at him briefly before looking back at Naomi. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low, almost private despite the room around them. And she gave a small shake of her head, a hint of a smile, touching the corner of her lips, not from amusement, but from understanding. "I did not handle it," she replied. "I just stayed the same." And the words settled between them with a quiet weight, because they carried the truth of the entire moment, and the difference between changing to fit a situation and refusing to be changed by it. And the governor nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement, and for a second, they both stood there, side by side, not as symbols, not as roles, but as people who understood the space they occupied and the responsibility that came with it. And across the room, the lights seemed warmer now, the music steadier, the atmosphere rebuilding itself around a truth that could not be unseen. And Naomi remained exactly where she was, unchanged, while everything else adjusted around her. The room did not return to what it had been before. It reshaped itself slowly, like a surface settling after a stone has been dropped into water. And Naomi could feel the difference in the way people moved around her now, not avoiding her, not staring openly, but aware, more aware than they had been just minutes ago. And that awareness carried a quiet weight, something that lingered in the pauses between conversations and in the careful way voices rose and fell. And she stood at the bar with her glass of water untouched for a moment, watching the reflection of the chandelier ripple faintly across its surface, the light bending with each subtle movement of her hand. And it grounded her, that small, ordinary detail, more than anything else in the room. And beside her, the governor shifted slightly, not stepping away, but adjusting his stance as if to give her space without leaving it entirely. And for a second, Neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense, no longer filled with expectation, but reflective, and Naomi broke it first, her voice low, steady. You always show up at the exact moment things get complicated. And there was no accusation in it, only observation, and he let out a quiet breath, his gaze moving across the room before returning to her. That is usually when people start making decisions they cannot take back, he replied, and she nodded faintly. Because she understood that too well, the way a single moment, a single assumption, could shape everything that followed. And across the room, Ethan had not left. He had not retreated into the background the way some might have. Instead, he remained visible, present, though no longer central, speaking briefly with another officer near the entrance. His gestures minimal, controlled, as if he were recalibrating himself in real time. And Naomi noticed that, the choice to stay, the refusal to disappear from the consequence of what had happened, and it did not soften the moment, but it shifted it slightly, because accountability, even quiet, changes the shape of things, and she turned her gaze back to the bar, her fingers tracing the faint outline of condensation left by her glass, and for a second, she allowed herself to feel it, not the embarrassment, not the anger, but the weight of being placed into a narrative that had never belonged to her, and the effort it took to stand still inside it without letting it define her. And then she exhaled, letting that weight settle somewhere deeper, somewhere it would not control her next move, and a woman approached the bar a few feet away, glancing briefly at Naomi before offering a small, tentative smile, the kind that acknowledged without intruding, and Naomi returned it, just as small, just as measured, because connection did not need to be loud to be real, and the music shifted then, something slower, smoother, the rhythm steady enough to let conversations rebuild fully, and the room began to breathe again, not as it had before, but with a new awareness threaded through it. And the governor glanced at Naomi once more, his expression thoughtful. Do you want to leave? He asked, not as an instruction, not as a suggestion, but as a question that gave her full control of the answer, and she shook her head slightly, her gaze steady. No, she said. I was invited, remember. And there was a quiet firmness in it, not defiance, not stubbornness, but ownership, and he nodded once, understanding exactly what she meant. Because leaving would have allowed the moment to define the space, and staying reclaimed it. Without needing to prove anything, and across the floor, Ethan finished his conversation and looked in their direction again, not approaching this time, not interrupting, but observing, and there was something different in his posture now, not just awareness, but restraint, the kind that comes from recognizing a boundary that had not been there before, and Naomi noticed it, and for a brief second, their eyes met across the room. Not as opposites, not as roles, but as two people who had shared a moment that neither of them would forget. And then she looked away, not dismissing him, just choosing not to hold the moment any longer than it needed to be held. And she reached for her glass again, taking a slow sip, the coolness grounding, and set it back down with a soft, deliberate motion. And then she stepped away from the bar, her heels quiet against the marble floor as she moved back into the space of the party. Not at the center, not at the edges, but somewhere in between, where she had always belonged, and people shifted slightly to make room for her, not out of obligation, not out of spectacle, but out of recognition. And she walked with the same steady pace she had carried from the beginning, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and the stain on her dress still visible under the light, no longer a mark of interruption, but a reminder of what had been seen and what had been understood. And as she moved through the room, the conversations did not stop, the music did not falter, but there was a subtle adjustment, a quiet respect that followed her without being announced, and behind her, the governor remained where he was for a moment longer, watching, not with concern, not with pride, but with a quiet acknowledgement of something deeper, something that had nothing to do with titles or roles, and everything to do with the way she had stood in a moment that could have reshaped her and chosen not to be reshaped at all. The rhythm of the room had settled into something steadier now, but it was not the same rhythm as before. It carried a new awareness that lingered beneath the music like a second layer, quieter but impossible to ignore. And as Naomi moved through the space, she could feel it in the way conversations adjusted when she passed, not stopping, not silencing, but shifting ever so slightly. as if people were recalibrating how they occupied the same air around her, and she did not rush, did not slow down, her steps even, measured, the soft echo of her heels against the marble floor blending with the low hum of voices and the steady pulse of the band. And she reached a small cluster of tall cocktail tables near the edge of the room, where a few guests stood talking, their conversation faltering just briefly as she approached before resuming with a more deliberate tone. And one of them, a man in a navy suit with silver at his temples, offered a polite nod. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice respectful, careful, and she returned the nod, her expression calm, not inviting conversation but not rejecting it either, and the group continued speaking, their topic shifting naturally into something lighter, something safe. Yet beneath it there was a quiet acknowledgement that they were all aware of what had just unfolded, and Naomi listened for a moment, not fully engaged, just present, letting the normalcy of the interaction settle around her, and for the first time since the evening had shifted, she felt the tension in her shoulders ease completely, not because the moment had been resolved, but because she had moved beyond it without needing to carry it forward. And across the room, Ethan stood near a column now, partially removed from the flow of the party, his posture relaxed but attentive, his eyes scanning not in the way they had before, searching for something out of place, but observing, taking in the room as a whole. And when his gaze found Naomi again, it did not linger with the same intensity. It was softer, more measured, as if he were seeing her within the context of the space rather than apart from it. And that difference mattered, even if it was small, and Naomi noticed it without reacting, without holding on to it, because recognition, once given, did not need to be chased, and she reached for a small appetizer from a passing tray. The simple act grounding, ordinary, the warmth of the room settling into something familiar again, and she took a small bite, the flavors barely registering, her focus still tuned to the subtle shifts around her, and a woman stepped closer to her table, her dress a soft shade of blue that caught the light as she moved, her expression open but cautious. "I hope you are all right," she said, her voice gentle, and Naomi met her gaze, offering a small, genuine smile this time. "I am," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to ease something in the woman, who nodded, before adding, "That should not have happened." And Naomi held her gaze for a moment longer before responding. "It happens more than people realize," and the truth of it settled quietly between them, not heavy, not accusatory, just present, and the woman nodded again, slower this time, as if absorbing something she had not fully considered before, and then she stepped back into her group, leaving Naomi once again in her own space, and the music swelled slightly, a saxophone carrying a smooth, steady line that filled the room with warmth, and Naomi let herself listen to it for a moment, really listen, the sound wrapping around the edges of the evening, smoothing what had been sharp, and behind her, the governor moved through the crowd, speaking briefly with a few guests, his presence still commanding but quieter now, less central, allowing the evening to continue without his shadow dominating it. And Naomi appreciated that, the way he stepped back without needing to announce it. And she turned slightly, her gaze drifting across the room, taking in the movement, the light, the subtle expressions that told their own quiet stories. And for a second, she caught Ethan again, closer now, not approaching her directly but moving through the same space, his steps unhurried, his posture open, and there was a moment, brief but clear, where their paths nearly intersected, where he could have stopped, could have spoken again, but he did not, and neither did she, and they passed within a few feet of each other, the distance small but meaningful, because it marked a boundary that both of them understood now. And as he continued on, Naomi felt something settle fully inside her, not relief, not closure, but clarity, the kind that comes from standing in a moment that could have reshaped you, and choosing instead to remain exactly who you are. And she took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, her posture steady, her presence quiet but certain, and as the night moved forward around her, she did not need to reclaim anything, did not need to prove anything, because the room had already shifted, and she had never needed it to in order to know her place within it. The night carried on, but not in the same way it had begun. It moved with intention now, each conversation more deliberate, each laugh a little more aware of the space it occupied, and Naomi found herself near the large windows that overlooked the city, the glass stretching from floor to ceiling, reflecting the warm glow of the chandeliers behind her, while the skyline beyond stood quiet and distant, a grid of lights blinking against the dark. And for a moment she stood there, not looking at her reflection, not adjusting her dress, but simply observing the contrast between inside and out, the controlled elegance of the room against the stillness of the streets far below, and she rested her fingertips lightly against the cool glass, feeling the difference in temperature, grounding herself again in something real, something untouched by perception. And behind her the music softened into a slower tempo, the kind that encouraged movement across the floor, and a few couples began to drift toward the center, their steps careful at first, then more confident as the rhythm settled, and Naomi watched them for a second, the quiet ease of their motion, the way they trusted the space to hold them without question. And she turned slightly, her gaze moving back into the room, and she noticed how people were no longer watching her directly, not with the same intensity, but there was still a subtle awareness, a recognition that followed her without being spoken, and she did not resist it, did not lean into it. She simply allowed it to exist without giving it control. And across the floor, Ethan stood near the edge of the dance area now, his attention not fixed on any one person, but scanning the room with a different kind of focus, not searching for disruption, but observing the flow. And there was something quieter in him now, something that had replaced the rigid certainty he had carried earlier, and Naomi could see it in the way he held himself, the slight shift in his shoulders, the absence of tension in his stance, and for a moment she wondered what that change felt like from his side. The realization of a mistake not as a single moment, but as something that lingered, something that required reflection beyond the surface. And she let the thought pass, not holding on to it, because understanding did not require her to carry it forward. And a man approached her then, older, his posture relaxed, his expression respectful but not cautious. "Miss Carter," he said, offering a small smile. "Would you care to dance?" And the question was simple, free of assumption, free of expectation, and Naomi considered it for a second, her gaze shifting briefly to the floor where the music continued to build, and she nodded once. "All right," she said, placing her hand lightly in his as they moved toward the center, her steps steady, unhurried, and as they joined the others, the rhythm guided them naturally, her movements smooth, controlled, not performative but present, and the act of dancing, of moving within the space without resistance, felt different now, not because the room had changed, but because she had already defined her place within it. And as they turned slowly across the floor, the light catching the edges of her dress, the stain still faintly visible but no longer the focus, it became part of the motion, part of the story without needing to be hidden. And Ethan watched from a distance, not with scrutiny, not with judgment, but with something closer to understanding, his gaze steady but softened, as if he were seeing the full picture now, not just the moment he had interrupted. And when Naomi's eyes met his briefly as she turned, there was no tension there, no unresolved conflict, just a quiet acknowledgement. And then the movement carried her past, the music guiding her back into the flow of the evening, and the governor stood near the edge of the room, speaking with a group of guests, his posture relaxed, his presence no longer dominating the space but integrated within it. And he glanced toward the dance floor just once, his expression calm, not watching over her, not monitoring, but recognizing. And Naomi felt that too, not as protection, but as trust, the kind that allowed her to exist fully within the moment without needing anything else. And as the song reached its midpoint, the rhythm steady and warm, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile, not directed at anyone, not meant to be seen, but simply because the tension that had once filled the room no longer defined it. And she moved with the music, her steps grounded, her presence unchanged, while everything around her continued to adjust, to learn, to shift in quiet ways that would linger long after the night had ended. The song did not end abruptly. It softened, its final notes stretching just long enough to let the movement on the floor slow naturally, couples easing their steps instead of stopping, and Naomi felt that transition through the subtle shift in her partner's hand, the way the rhythm guided them to stillness without breaking the flow. and when the music faded completely, there was a brief, shared pause across the room. A quiet acknowledgement before the next track began to build in the background. Lighter now, more upbeat, and her partner released her hand with a polite nod. "Thank you," he said, his tone warm but measured, and Naomi returned the gesture with a small smile. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady, and as he stepped away, she remained where she was for a second, letting the stillness settle back into her body, her breathing even, her posture relaxed, and the faint echo of the music lingered in the air like a memory that had not fully left, and around her, people shifted again, some returning to conversations, others staying on the floor, adjusting to the new tempo, and Naomi turned slightly, her gaze scanning the room without searching, simply observing, and she noticed how the energy had changed completely from earlier, not just softened, but deepened, as if the room itself had learned something it had not expected to learn, and that awareness moved through the space in small ways. In the way people spoke more thoughtfully, in the way glances were held a second longer, not out of curiosity but reflection, and she stepped off the dance floor, her heels quiet against the marble as she made her way back toward the edge of the room, the fabric of her dress moving lightly with each step, the faint stains still visible under the warm light, but no longer drawing attention. And as she reached the side, she paused near one of the tall columns, her hand resting briefly against its smooth surface, the cool stone grounding, and she let her eyes close. For just a second, not to escape the moment, but to mark it, to acknowledge that something had shifted not only around her, but within the space itself, and when she opened them again, she saw Ethan standing a few feet away, not directly in her path, not approaching, but close enough that the distance between them was intentional, and for a moment neither of them moved, the noise of the room continuing around them without interruption, and then he took a small step forward, stopping at a respectful distance, his posture open, his expression composed but no longer guarded, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying none of the authority it had earlier. "Miss Carter," he said, and there was a brief pause, not hesitation, but care in how he chose his words. "I have been thinking about what you said," and Naomi watched him, her expression calm, giving him the space to continue, and he exhaled slightly before speaking again. "I asked you to prove something I had already decided was not there," he said, repeating her words with a quiet acknowledgement. And that was not about protocol, and the admission settled between them, not heavy, not dramatic, but real, and Naomi held his gaze, her eyes steady, and for a second she did not respond, not because she was withholding anything, but because she was allowing the moment to exist without rushing it forward, and then she nodded once. "That is where it starts," she said, her voice even, and Ethan absorbed that. The simplicity of it, the clarity, and he nodded as well, a small movement that carried more weight than any explanation could have, and for a brief moment, the space between them felt balanced, not equal in experience, not identical in understanding, but grounded in something shared, a recognition that had not been there before. And then Naomi shifted her weight slightly, her gaze moving past him toward the rest of the room, and she said, "What you do with that matters more than what already happened." And the statement was not a challenge, not a demand, just a truth placed gently but firmly, and Ethan followed her gaze for a second before returning it to her, and there was something in his expression that suggested he understood the responsibility in that. Not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that the moment did not end here, and he stepped back then, not retreating, but giving space, and Naomi inclined her head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement, and then she turned, moving away from the column and back into the flow of the room, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, and the music continued, the conversations layered over it, the night unfolding in its new rhythm. And as she walked, she passed by groups of guests who no longer shifted awkwardly, no longer glanced with uncertainty, but engaged naturally, their awareness now part of the space rather than separate from it. And she reached the window again, the city lights still steady beyond the glass, unchanged by anything that had happened inside, and she rested her hand lightly against it once more, feeling the cool surface, the quiet contrast. And for a moment she allowed herself to stand between those two worlds, the controlled elegance behind her and the vast stillness beyond. and she understood then that the night had not changed who she was. It had only revealed how others chose to see her, and that difference, once seen, could not be undone. And as she turned back toward the room, her posture steady, her expression calm, she carried that understanding with her, not as a weight, but as something clear, something grounded, something that did not need to be proven again. The glass felt colder this time when her fingertips touched it, as if the night outside had pressed itself harder against the window, steady and indifferent to everything that had unfolded inside. And Naomi stood there for a moment longer than before, her reflection faint in the glass, not sharp, not defined, just a soft outline layered over the city lights. And behind her the music shifted again, a brighter tempo now, something that carried energy back into the room, but not the careless energy from earlier. This one felt measured, earned, like a rhythm that understood its own weight. And she exhaled slowly, her breath barely visible against the surface before fading. And when she turned back, the room did not feel like a stage anymore. It felt like a space she could move through, without resistance, without needing to brace herself for the next interruption. And she stepped away from the window, her heels quiet against the marble, the sound blending into the background rather than cutting through it. And as she moved, she noticed the small details again. The way a server adjusted a tray with careful precision. The way a couple laughed softly at something shared. The way the light caught the edges of glassware and scattered across the room in brief flashes. And those details grounded her more than anything else, because they were real, unaffected by perception. And near the center of the room, the governor stood speaking with a small group, his posture relaxed, his voice low. And as she approached, he glanced toward her briefly, not calling her over, not signaling, just acknowledging her presence in a way that did not pull her into his orbit, but allowed her to choose her own path. And she appreciated that, the quiet understanding in it, and she slowed slightly, not joining the group, not avoiding it, just passing through the edge of that space. And one of the guests, a woman with a composed demeanor and a steady gaze, turned toward her. "Miss Carter," she said, her tone respectful but natural, and Naomi nodded in return. "Good evening," she replied, her voice even, and the woman smiled faintly, not with curiosity, not with caution, but with something more grounded. "It is a pleasure to meet you," she added, and Naomi held her gaze for a moment before responding, "Likewise." And there was no weight in the exchange, no tension beneath it, just a simple interaction that felt unforced. And as she moved past, she could feel the difference clearly now, the absence of that earlier pressure, the way the room no longer tried to define her before she spoke. And across the floor, Ethan stood near the exit now, his posture still attentive but no longer rigid. And there was a subtle shift in his focus, not scanning for disruption, but observing the flow of people leaving and entering, ensuring movement rather than controlling it. And Naomi noticed that change, not as something she needed to acknowledge directly, but as something that had settled into the space on its own. And as she passed within a few feet of him again, he did not step forward this time, did not interrupt, but he did incline his head slightly, a small gesture, respectful, measured, and Naomi returned it with a brief nod. Nothing more, nothing less. And the simplicity of that exchange carried more weight than any conversation could have, because it did not try to rewrite what had happened. It simply acknowledged what had been understood, and she continued on, her steps steady, her presence quiet but certain, and she reached the far side of the room where a set of doors led out to a balcony, the glass panels reflecting the interior light while hinting at the open air beyond. And she paused there, her hand resting lightly on the handle without opening it yet. And for a second, she listened, not to the music, not to the voices, but to the absence of tension that had once filled the space. And it was noticeable now, the way the air felt lighter without being empty, the way the room carried itself with a different kind of awareness. And she pushed the door open gently, stepping out onto the balcony where the night air met her immediately, cool and clean, carrying the distant hum of the city below. And she took a slow breath, letting it fill her lungs fully before releasing it, the sensation grounding, resetting, and she rested her hands lightly on the railing, looking out over the skyline, the lights stretching in every direction, constant, unaffected. And for a moment, She allowed herself to stand there without thinking about the room behind her, without replaying the moment that had started the night, just existing in the quiet space between what had happened and what would come next. And inside, through the glass, the party continued, the movement steady, the rhythm consistent, and she knew when she stepped back in, nothing about her would be different, and that was the point. Because the night had not changed her, it had only revealed what needed to be seen. And as she turned slightly, her reflection catching faintly in the glass once more, she saw not the moment that had defined the room, but the stillness that had carried her through it. And that stillness remained, unchanged, unshaken, something that did not need to be proven again. The night air lingered on her skin even after she stepped back inside, the coolness fading slowly as the warmth of the room wrapped around her again. But something of that stillness stayed with her, settling deeper than before, and Naomi closed the balcony door gently behind her. The soft click barely audible over the music, yet it marked a quiet transition, a return not to the same room she had left, but to a space that now felt altered in ways that could not be reversed. And as she moved forward, the light caught her again, the faint stain on her dress still visible under the glow, no longer sharp, no longer disruptive, just present, like a memory that did not need to be erased to lose its power. And she walked with the same steady pace, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze level, and people shifted around her naturally, not creating distance, not drawing closer, just adjusting in a way that acknowledged her presence without questioning it. And near the center of the room, Ethan stood alone now, no longer engaged in conversation, his attention not fixed on any one point but inward, his posture still composed but quieter, as if the weight of the evening had settled into him in a way that required space to process. And when he saw her approach, he did not hesitate this time. He stepped forward, closing the distance carefully, stopping at a respectful space between them. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the music filling the silence, a low steady rhythm that carried the night forward. And then he said, "I have requested to be reassigned after tonight." His voice calm, not defensive, not seeking approval, just stating a decision that had already been made. And Naomi studied him, her expression thoughtful, not surprised, but attentive to the meaning behind the words. And he continued, "Not because of what happened here alone, but because I realized I have been seeing situations through a lens that I never questioned, and the honesty in that admission did not come easily. It carried the weight of something deeper than the moment itself." And Naomi let the words settle. Before responding, "Leaving will not change that," she said, her tone even, not dismissive, not critical, just clear, and Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it. "I know," he replied, "but staying the same will not change it either." And there was a quiet resolve in his voice now, not certainty, but intention, and Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, recognizing the shift, not as a resolution, not as an ending, but as a beginning that would not be easy. And she said, "Then do not walk away from it, walk through it." And the words were simple, but they carried a direction that required more than distance, and Ethan nodded again, more firmly this time, the meaning settling into him. And for a second, the space between them felt steady, not defined by the earlier tension, but by the understanding that had replaced it. And then Naomi stepped slightly to the side, not dismissing him, not holding him there, just continuing her movement through the room. And he did not follow, he did not interrupt, he simply remained where he was, watching her go for a brief moment before turning his gaze outward again, his posture no longer anchored in authority, but in awareness. And across the room, the governor had noticed the exchange, his eyes moving briefly between them before returning to the conversation he was engaged in, his expression unchanged, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in it, a recognition that the moment had extended beyond what could be managed or controlled. And Naomi moved toward the far end of the room again, where the music felt softer, where the edges of the crowd gave way to quieter conversations, and she paused near a table where a small group stood, their discussion calm, their laughter genuine, and one of them looked toward her, offering a welcoming nod, not cautious, not performative, just natural, and she returned it, stepping into the space without hesitation, her presence fitting without resistance. And as they spoke, the conversation flowed easily, unforced, moving from one topic to another without the weight that had once hung over every interaction, and Naomi allowed herself to be part of it, not guarded, not withdrawn, but present, her voice steady, her laughter soft but real. And as the night continued, the earlier moment did not disappear. It remained, but it no longer defined the room. It became part of its history, something that had shifted the space in a way that could not be undone. And Naomi felt that shift not as a burden, but as clarity, something that allowed her to move forward without carrying what had already been understood. And as she stood there, the light warm against her skin, the music steady in the background, she realized that nothing about her had needed to change for the room to see her differently. And that truth settled into her with a quiet strength, something that did not need to be spoken, something that simply was. The evening no longer felt like an event that needed to prove itself. It had settled into something quieter, something more honest, and Naomi could feel it in the way conversations no longer circled around status or introductions, but moved naturally, like people had remembered how to simply exist in the same space without measuring each other first. And she stood near the edge of the group she had joined, listening as someone described a project in careful detail, their hands moving subtly to shape the story. And she found herself responding without hesitation, asking a question that shifted the conversation forward rather than just acknowledging it. And the man paused, surprised for a fraction of a second, not by her presence, but by the clarity of her insight, and then nodded, answering with more depth, the exchange unfolding easily, without tension, without the need for validation. And around them, the room carried on in that same steady rhythm, the music threading through the space without overpowering it, the light reflecting off glass and polished surfaces in soft, consistent patterns. And Naomi realized that the room had not just adjusted to her, it had adjusted to itself. And that change felt more lasting than anything that had been said aloud. And across the floor, Ethan had moved closer to the exit, speaking quietly with another officer, his posture composed but no longer rigid. And when their conversation ended, he did not linger. He stepped back, allowing the space to function without his presence dominating it. And that choice, small as it seemed, carried weight, because it showed an awareness that had not been there before. And Naomi noticed it without focusing on it, letting it exist as part of the larger shift rather than as a separate moment. And nearby, the governor had stepped away from his group, his gaze moving across the room with a calm attentiveness. And when it reached Naomi, he did not call out, did not signal, he simply met her eyes for a brief second and nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that required nothing in return, and she returned it just as simply, her expression steady. And then the moment passed, folding back into the flow of the evening. And as the conversation around her began to wind down, the group naturally dispersing into smaller clusters, Naomi stepped away, moving toward the center of the room once more, not because she needed to be there, but because there was no longer a reason to avoid any part of the space. And she paused near the bar again, the same place where the night had first shifted, and for a moment she stood there, her hand resting lightly against the surface, feeling the smoothness beneath her fingertips, the same grounding detail that had steadied her earlier. And she glanced down at her dress, the faint stain still visible, softened now under the light, no longer drawing attention, and she brushed her hand over it gently, not to remove it, but to acknowledge it, a quiet reminder of what had happened and what had been understood. And then she lifted her gaze, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and she noticed how no one was watching her now. Not because she had disappeared into the background, but because she had become part of the space in a way that did not require observation. And that difference settled into her with a quiet clarity, something that did not need to be spoken. And as she turned slightly, preparing to move again, she heard her name spoken behind her, not loudly, not with urgency, but clearly enough to reach her without cutting through the room. And she turned to see Ethan standing a few feet away, not approaching too quickly, not closing the distance without invitation. And when she met his gaze, he spoke, his voice steady. "I will remember this." And the words were simple, not an apology, not a promise, but something in between, something that carried intention without trying to define it. And Naomi held his gaze for a moment, her expression calm, and then she nodded once. "That is enough," she said, her voice even, because it was not her place to measure what came next for him, only to recognize the moment as it was. And Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting that, and then he stepped back, not lingering, not waiting for more, just allowing the space to remain balanced, and Naomi turned again, moving away from the bar, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, and as she walked through the room, the night continued around her, the music steady, the conversations layered and warm, the light consistent and calm, and nothing about her had needed to shift for the space to recognize her fully, and that truth stayed with her, not as a conclusion, but as something quieter, something that would remain long after the evening ended, a kind of understanding that did not demand attention, but quietly reshaped everything it touched. The night began to soften at the edges, not ending all at once, but easing into something quieter, the music lowering just enough to let the room breathe without losing its rhythm. And Naomi stood near the center once more, not because she needed to be seen, but because there was no longer a place she did not belong, and the space around her felt balanced in a way that had not existed before, conversations flowing naturally, laughter steady but not loud, the kind that comes from comfort rather than performance. And she moved slowly, not toward anything specific, just through the room, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, and as she passed the bar again, she paused for a brief second, her fingers brushing the smooth surface, the same place where everything had shifted hours earlier, and for a moment she let herself remember it, not the tension, not the weight, but the stillness she had held through it, the quiet refusal to become smaller in a space that had tried to define her too quickly, and she lifted her hand, letting it fall naturally to her side, the gesture simple, almost unnoticed, but grounding, and across the room, guests began to gather their coats, their conversations winding down into quieter exchanges, the kind that signal an evening reaching its natural close, and Naomi watched them, without focusing on any one person, her gaze soft, taking in the movement as a whole. And near the entrance, Ethan stood with another officer, speaking briefly before stepping aside, his posture relaxed, his presence no longer carrying the same tension, and when their conversation ended, he glanced toward Naomi one last time, not to approach, not to interrupt, but simply to acknowledge, and she met his gaze for a second, just long enough to recognize that the moment between them had reached its end, not erased, not forgotten, but understood, and then he turned, moving toward the exit, his steps steady, his shoulders no longer rigid, and as the door opened and closed behind him, the space he left behind did not feel empty. It felt complete, like a chapter that had found its natural conclusion, and Naomi shifted her attention back to the room, where the governor now stood near the far side, speaking with a small group, his presence still calm, still grounded, and when he noticed her, he did not call out, did not signal, he simply gave a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement he had offered earlier, and she returned it, her expression steady, and for a moment that was enough. No words needed, no explanation required, just a shared understanding that did not need to be expanded. And as the music faded into its final track, softer now, almost background to the quiet conversations that remained, Naomi moved toward the windows one last time, the city lights still stretching endlessly beyond the glass, unchanged, constant, and she rested her hand lightly against the cool surface, feeling the contrast between the warmth behind her and the stillness beyond, and she took a slow breath, letting it settle deep before releasing it, her reflection faint in the glass, not defined by the room, not shaped by the moment that had unfolded, just present, just real, and for a second, she allowed herself to stand there without thinking about what had happened, without replaying it, without measuring it, just existing in the quiet space between the end of the night and whatever would come next. And behind her, the room continued to empty gradually, the sounds softening, the energy settling, and when she finally turned away from the window, her steps were unhurried, her posture the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning, and she walked toward the exit, not as someone leaving behind something unresolved, but as someone who had moved through a moment without letting it define her. And as she reached the door, she paused briefly, her hand resting on the handle, not hesitating, just